From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening. From Coolidge Auditorium in the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C., WETA presents Fiction, a conversation with John Updike and Peter Taylor. This evening, authors John Updike and Peter Taylor will read and discuss selections from their works of fiction. Talking with Mr. Updike and Mr. Taylor will be James Dickey, consultant in poetry to the Library of Congress. Mr. Dickey was the recipient of the National Book Award for his volume of 22 poems, Buck Dancer's Choice. He was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1923 and has published 5 volumes of poetry. He is now enjoying his second term as the library's poetry consultant. Peter Taylor is a playwright and novelist as well as a short story writer. Among his awards and honors have been Guggenheim, Fulbright, and Ford Foundation fellowships, and an O. Henry Memorial Award's first prize. Mr. Taylor was born in 1919 and has taught in colleges and universities for more than 20 years. He is currently a professor of English at the University of Virginia. Mr. Taylor has been cited as one of the most accomplished short story writers of our time. John Updike is the 35-year-old author of The Centaur, a novel published in 1963 which won the National Book Award. He was a summa cum laude graduate of Harvard College and has published volumes of short stories, prose, and poetry, in addition to his 4 novels. Mr. Updike has been hailed as one of the most gifted writers of his generation. He makes one of his rare personal appearances on this program. And now, here is Mr. Dickey.
We'll begin with Mr. Peter Taylor. Mr. Taylor, will you oblige us?
Thank you. This is a story that's I've written recently, and I've tried to accommodate it to the time we have, or the time to it. So you'll excuse if some of the characters are exceedingly flat, while others have great depth, I hope. It's called The Elect. It was really as though someone were dead. You might well have expected to find black crepe hung on the front door. The telephone was off the hook. The doorbell had been muffled. The best thing Judge Larble's wife could do was to keep busy at her little tasks. And although it was past 2 in the afternoon, Judge Larble himself was still sleeping like a baby in the big upstairs bedroom at the back of the house. Outside the house, their faithful son-in-law, Joseph, along with several of the judge's ardent supporters, and 2 state troopers as well, was stationed on the wide front porch to receive and ultimately drive away any of the TV people or even the party's own public relations people who might come banging on the door. The judge had fought a long, hard battle, and he had won. He was now governor-elect of the state. Surely the governor-elect was entitled to his rest. In his wife's opinion, at any rate, amongst the spoils belonging to the victor should be included some small measure of privacy. The wall clock in the downstairs hallway struck 2:15. The state's first lady-elect sat at her little desk at the end of the living room. She was writing checks. She was paying last month's bills from the department stores, from the oil companies, from the grocer, from the dry cleaners, from the drugstore. In the final weeks of the campaign, she had let everything go. As a matter of fact, she had actually taken up residence in a suite of rooms at the hotel opposite the Capitol building. She had lived as she had never imagined she could possibly live. She had, in those last weeks, joined in the campaign, much as she hated it all, had taken to the road with the rest of the family, appearing on platforms in 20 counties, waving, smiling, giving the victory sign. She had even made a half-dozen little impromptu 2-minute speeches of her own when nobody else from the family was there to speak up. Even the opposition newspapers had called her a good trooper and said she was well-spoken. Her best and most oft-quoted words were those delivered to a jokester in a crowd who had called out asking if she wanted to go keep house in that musty old governor's mansion. She had replied with, "Whither he goes, there I shall go also. His people shall be my people." And the crowd had roared its crude, infelicitous approval. "Give 'em hell, Nell." But now it was over. In the hotel ballroom at 3 a.m., posturing before the television cameras, Judge Larwell's opposition had conceded. The race was done. Now the judge's wife could once again enjoy the dignity of being Mrs. Larwell and not Nell Larwell, as the newspapers, opposition and otherwise, had insisted upon calling her. During the campaign, you had to endure almost anything. That is, you did if, in the modern way, you joined in the fray alongside your husband. Halfway through the campaign, when things began to seem uncertain for the judge, and she had to begin climbing on platforms and making a spectacle of herself, she realized who were the two most sympathetic figures in American public life. They were Bess Truman and Mamie Eisenhower. Clearly, those two had hated it all as much as she had. They were women of some background, like herself. And like herself, they had recognized their duty and had carried on. Everyone had said that she, unlike them, must have known what to expect, coming as she did from a political family, having once as a child lived in the musty old mansion. But in her papa's day, it had been different. In those days, a candidate's wife stayed at home with her family, went her usual social rounds, got her bills paid on time. The intrusions of TV and the pressures from PR men had not existed then. It had been very different. Mrs. Larwell's mother, as First Lady of the state, had said that the principal adjustment she had had to make was to the ever-present sense of living beyond her means. Yes, in those days, the family of a successful politician had to learn to live like rich people. Nowadays, they had to learn to live like show people. When at last Judge Larwell called from upstairs saying that he was hungry, Mrs. Larwell appeared in the doorway from the living room and stood at the foot of the stairs. She was smiling up at him. It was a good sign if he were hungry. It meant he had not fixed his mind on her yet this morning. The cook could give him his breakfast or lunch, and she could finish paying her last month's bills. "I'll tell Nola you're up," she called. "Would you like to have her bring you something on a tray?" "I would not," he replied, clearing his throat. Then, striking a Napoleonic pose, slipping his hand inside his plaid robe and dropping his chin to his bare chest, he intoned, "The governor does not choose to eat alone." Mrs. Larwell laughed obligingly. "I'll be down shortly," he said. She recognized his elated mood and knew, of course, that was what she could have expected today. "All right, my dear," she said. She returned to the living room, but she was hardly through the doorway before she heard him call again. He simply called her name, "Nell." She heard him clearly, but at the far end of the living room, her little spinet desk beckoned to her. No, not the desk itself so much as the stack of bills with their address panes, and her own business envelopes in the half-open drawer, and the checkbooks spread out on the surface of the desk, and even the tiny roll of stamps and her own stick-on return addresses. They held out their arms to her like so many little children. But the wife of the governor-elect knew where her first duty lay. She knew that in the future some secretary could take care of her personal bills and perhaps even her personal correspondence. The small satisfaction of writing out those checks and then scratching the bills off her list was not important. What difference did those bills make? She heard the voice at the top of the stairs asking, "Do you know where my Tattersall shirt is? I want to wear it with my blue suit." Yes, in the future, some well-trained secretary would have to take care of her personal bills. She could see already that she would have to consent to that. Presently, she was walking quickly up the stairway, and she was wondering, would it come now? Would he speak to her now of his appreciation of her joining in the campaign when she had hated it so? She stopped for a moment and went back to the kitchen to put the telephone on the hook and to tell Nola that Judge Larwell was ready to eat something now. Then she started upstairs again, and again the question filled her mind. Would it come now? How she longed to postpone the moment when he would try to speak to her of it. How she dreaded the moment, and yet she could not say why she did so. When the two of them came down to breakfast or lunch, quarter of an hour later, she found that Nola had places set for 3 in the breakfast room. Somehow, overlooking this obvious fact, she called through the kitchen doorway for Nola to set an additional place for herself and one for their son-in-law, Joseph. "I already have," replied Nola cheerfully. "Oh, yes, I see you have." And Mrs. Larwell detected in her own voice an absurd, resentful note. She ought to have been glad, she told herself, that the cook could guess she and Joseph would wish to have a bite while the judge ate. But she was so keenly, so painfully aware of being out of touch with the operation of her own kitchen and household that she had a silly sense of being superseded. Nola had even sent Horace, the yard man and chauffeur who had been guarding the back door, had sent Horace around to the front porch to invite Joseph to come in. And presently Joseph appeared, his face flushed from being out in the autumn weather all morning, and his manner all smiles and congratulations. "List, oh list," began Joseph, sitting down at the breakfast table. "List, oh list. Really, you would hardly believe how many important folks have tried to force their way past me this morning. Oh, I could tell thee a tale." Joseph was considered quite literary and had even helped the judge with the wording of a good many of his speeches, though Mrs. Larwell was not always sure that his additions and corrections were beneficial. Sometimes in the middle of a speech she had recognized Joseph's words on the judge's lips, and somehow from that point on the speech would not ring true to her somehow. Her own father had never allowed anyone to tamper with his speeches, and to him the very idea of hiring a ghostwriter, an idea which the judge had recently been entertaining, would have been abhorrent. Still, Joseph was a loyal admirer of the judge's, and that had to be appreciated. The other son-in-law out in California was an engineer and was openly scornful of politics and politicians. But Joseph had been at the judge's side throughout the campaign, had been there, in fact, at times when his mother-in-law had thought he ought to be at home with his pregnant wife. During these same months, the daughter in California had also been pregnant, and the engineer had given this as their excuse for not coming home for the election. Well, at any rate, Joseph had not slept at all last night and had been on the front porch this morning, protecting the judge's well-earned right to rest. "You couldn't believe," he said, "how little consideration some of those fellows show for a man who has fought the hard campaign you have, and how little respect, in fact, they have for the office of governor of this state. I really don't believe I could have kept them out if those 2 state troopers hadn't been there with me. One newspaper man pretended he had a note to you from Senator Bryce, and when I asked to see the note, he just laughed in my face and walked away, wadding up the paper and stuffing it in his pocket." The judge laughed pleasurably at Joseph's reporting of this last little incident. "Well, I'm afraid that's how it's going to be from here out," he declared. "The campaign was nothing to how it will be from here out. I'll be needing you all the way, Joseph. I don't know what your title will be, but I'll be needing you to keep such fellows off my back." "Oh," exclaimed Mrs. Larwell, interrupting suddenly, "I should think your secretaries and the state troopers together could do that without taking up your own son-in-law's time." There was an asperity in her words that she had not intended should be there, and that seemed to draw her husband's attention entirely away from Joseph. She saw him drop his eyes from Joseph to the plate which Nola had just set before him, and then lift them to her own face. It was a trick of his she had often observed in the past. She had observed that in any conversation he seldom moved directly from one important subject to another. That is, there was always an effort to prevent your detecting the mental associations he made, or the logic of his transitions. She had always acknowledged that he was too subtle and too deep for her, acknowledged it to him, but there were moments when she had consciously to conceal from him her own knowledge of his depths and subtleties. "Nola," she called over her shoulder, turning her face away from him and toward the kitchen, "give us luncheon forks, please, and not these big dinner forks. Nola." But there was no answer from the kitchen. "Nell, darling, began the judge seriously. She pretended not to hear him. Although she and Joseph, as well as the judge, had already been served, she snatched the forks from beside their plates, and rising from her chair, she set out for the kitchen. Nola was nowhere to be seen. After serving them, Nola had no doubt stepped over to her room for a moment, or she might, so far as her mistress knew, have put on her hat and coat and left the house forever. That was how little Miss Larwell felt she knew of what her own cook might do nowadays. "Nola," she called again. And the silence which she got for answer somehow made her think of the names of other cooks she had had over the years. She was tempted almost to stand there calling their names. "Minerva, Gertrude, Clara, where are you?" Nola seemed no less someone out of the past than they. But realizing that her husband and her son-in-law were waiting for their forks, Mrs. Larwell scurried back through the breakfast room and into the dining room. She went there to fetch the luncheon forks. But where were they? She had pulled open the top shallow drawer to the buffet and found that they were not in their old accustomed place. Where could Nola have put them? It seemed incredible that she didn't know where her own flat silver was kept any longer. She was tempted, almost, to return to the breakfast room and announce that Nola and the flat silver were missing. Instead, when she opened the swinging door and saw her son-in-law and her husband waiting there without forks, she quickly crossed over and put one of the dinner forks in the judge's hand. He accepted it, but simultaneously seized her free hand with his own. "Thank you," he said gently. "Thank you for the fork, my darling, and thank you for everything else." She saw him glance across the table at Joseph and heard him say, "She's been a wonderful campaigner, hasn't she, Joe?" She knew his glance at Joseph meant nothing, and yet she had a sense of discovering a conspiracy between them. Only, of course, it wasn't merely between them. The entire world somehow was conspiring against her. She could feel the blood draining from her cheeks. It seemed she might actually faint. "I never saw anything like it," Joseph was saying, wresting his own fork from her. Boy, what a campaigner she turned out to be. The timid, reserved little Mrs. Larwell. I'll never forget that night at Lawrenceburg when the rest of us sat there tongue-tied, how she stepped up to the lectern and began, "I plead guilty to the soft impeachment." Until that night, I hadn't known my pretty little mother-in-law had such powers of rhetoric. "It was a quotation I used," Mrs. Larwell said in a whisper, her voice trembling. She was remembering that wretched moment at Lawrenceburg when it had seemed anything would be better than the silence. Someone in the crowd there had called out a phrase used in one of the opposition papers that morning, "the genteel judge." She had felt he was being attacked for the decent good manners she had always encouraged in him. And this had happened on the very first night he had been able to persuade her to sit on the platform. "What I won't forget," the judge was saying, "is the sight of her shaking hands with the line of mill workers at Cedar Point. When those old codgers and those young roughnecks who had been heckling me only 15 minutes before saw who they were going to shake hands with, they came flocking from all over the plant." The judge held on to her hands now and gave it to her hand and gave it a series of squeezes as he spoke. And it really was as if she were out there in the rain at Cedar Point again, wearing her rain hat and raincoat and shaking hands with all those young boys and old men. While she had stood there in the rain, it had come over her that there were no middle-aged men amongst the mill hands. There were only smooth-faced young boys mixed with young boys who had at some point turned into rough-faced old men. Her heart had gone out unreservedly to those young boys and those old boys. And afterward, at home that night, the memory that there had been no middle-aged man amongst them touched her. But what had troubled her most when she was alone that night was the realization that she had shaken their hands with a genuine cordiality and that she was not somehow capable of a professional cordiality. She had acted upon her real feelings, and the result was that the persons she had deceived that day were not the old mill hands or the young mill hands, but her husband, her middle-aged husband, and her son-in-law, and Miss Ledbetter and Jake Ransom and Billy Henderson. "My darling Nell," the judge was saying now, still holding her hand, and though Joseph was still present, addressing her in a language and tone that he had always heretofore reserved for their private exchanges, "my darling, you do have powers I never suspected you possessed. I owe you a debt that I can never repay. And the bad part is that I have no doubt that you will go on increasing that debt of mine so long as we live." Nell Larwell burst into tears. With her own dinner fork clutched in one hand and with the judge holding onto her other hand, she began heaving and sobbing, the contorted features of her face completely exposed. The moment had come. She had known how it would be without knowing she knew. What she had dreaded, what she had known to expect without knowing she knew, was that his expression of gratitude would be but an expression of his desire and his will that she not now discontinue her public role. Tears quite literally flooded her eyes and flowed down her cheeks. It was as though quite literally some dam within her had burst. She knew there was no turning back, no answering him. As he came to his feet and looked directly into her eyes, she felt a flash of hatred for him, this handsome, middle-aged man. She remembered his saying to Joseph at some point in the campaign, "Do only small favors for others on the ticket and ask only large ones." She had hated him, hated the prosperous, successful middle age they were sharing, but only for the one moment. She loved him. He was her life. But her life would be changed now. The world was changed now, however, and it was only that she must change with it. Everybody had to change with the times, didn't they? It was her duty to him to change. Politicians no longer had to learn to live like rich people. They had to learn to live like show people. Somehow she would learn. The judge had his arms about her, and Joseph had come round to her too. They were both calling her a perfect darling. They were touched that she should shed tears over his expression of gratitude. Beyond Joseph's tear-blurred silhouette, she had an even more blurred glimpse of the kitchen and saw that Nola had returned and was in command there. Drying her eyes and cheeks on a napkin which the judge had handed her, Mrs. Larwell said, "I'm being so silly. How silly can a woman be? The wife of the governor-elect. This should be the happiest day of our life, and I shouldn't spoil it with tears." Looking at her son-in-law, she said with a baffled smile, "Many are called, but few are chosen." "Wonderful," replied her literary son-in-law. Then to her husband she said, "I'm through with crying now," and she went up on her toes and kissed him on the clean-shaven cheek. Then the three of them sat down to their brunch together, busying themselves with their large dinner forks. And it seemed to the wife of the governor-elect that she was quite literally through with crying, that she might really never shed another tear so long as she lived.
Do you want to say anything that brings up? Or
well, I think the applause says it very well. There are many things crossed my mind listening to it. Mr. Taylor's directness of touch has always amazed me, and he's been likened to Chekhov, and there is that right touch, the way the forks reappear, the way nothing is wasted, really. And remember, this is a story that he very kindly cut a little. I wish he hadn't, actually, with the economy, the way that the judge is first seen sleeping like a baby, and the sense throughout of victory as some kind of burden, I think is just so beautifully carried out, and that the humor, of which there's much, doesn't conceal the sadness of it, the feminine sadness, which I think is done. You know, I'm quite convinced, and I hope that my wife never becomes governor of our state.
What strikes me as being an awfully good kind of direction for fiction is to show in what intimate ways the public life and the private, say, family life, which is concerned with things like forks and so on, interconnect. I think we have the tendency to believe that public life, although no matter how much the national magazines and newspapers and so on try to convince us otherwise, we know really that the public life of an important man is only public and and has very little private affiliations and connections. The great thing to me about a story like this is to show in what very intimate and human ways the public life and the life of the would you say the well again the public life is connected with by very small and very intimate ways with an extremely intimate family life which the public never sees. This is something I think we need to be reminded of. Examples in current large public life don't have to be evoked, but you can evoke them if you like. So, if there are no other comments, John, you don't want to. Do you want to say anything, Peter?
No,
about
thank you. Never.
Yeah, all right. We can have. We would like maybe to have you read some things.
I will read. I just want to repeat my admiration of that story and of all of Mr. Taylor's that I've read. The kind of goodness, the kind of goodness in the author that comes out as sort of a roundness and a firmness in the prose that I like it in writers. I'll read quite a different kind of story. This may be a mistake. It's called Harv is Plowing Now. It's from my last book. It's an attempt to trace the curve of an emotion through a triptych of perhaps violently different images in my own mind as I wrote it, they were very coherent, and the hope is that the end of the story knits them together. But it is an attempt to for myself at least, to broaden what a story is, and there's so many of them written that surely a few of them can be written in I was going to use the word tricky. I don't mean to be tricky, but in some way of bringing in the kinds of knowledge that maybe are. It's called Harv, it's H-A-R-V, is Plowing Now. Our lives submit to archaeology. For a period in my life, which seems longer ago than it was, I lived in a farmhouse that lacked electricity and central heating. In the living room, we had a fireplace and, as I remember, a kind of chocolate-colored rectangular stove whose top was a double row of slots and whose metal feet rested on a sheet of asbestos. I have not thought of this stove for years. Its image seems to thrust one corner from the bottom of a trench. It was as high as a boy and heated a rectangular space of air around it. When I was sick, my parents would huddle me, in blankets, on a blue sofa next to the stove, and I would try to align myself with its margin of warmth while my fever rose and fell, transforming at its height my blanketed knees into weird, intimate mountains at whose base a bowl of broth seemed a circular lake seen from afar. The stove was fueled with what we called coal oil. I wonder now, what must have been obvious then, if coal oil and kerosene are exactly the same thing. Yes, they must be, for I remember filling the stove and the kerosene lamps from the same can, a 5-gallon can with a side spout and a central cap, which had to be loosened when I poured. Otherwise, by some trick of air pressure, the can would bob and buck in my hands like an awkwardly live thing, and the spurting liquid, transparent and pungent, would spill. What was kerosene in the lamps became coal oil in the stove. So there are essential differences as well as existential ones. What is bread in the oven becomes Christ in the mouth. When spring came, our attention thawed and was free to run outdoors. From where we lived, not a highway, not a tower, not even a telephone pole was visible. We lived on the side of a hill surrounded by trees and grass and clouds. Across a shallow valley where a greening meadow lay idle, another farm faced ours from a mirroring rise of land. Though the disposition of the barns and sheds was different, the houses were virtually identical. Pennsylvania sandstone farmhouses, set square to the compass and slightly tall for their breadth, as if the attic windows were straining to see over the trees. They must have been built at about the same time in the last century and had been similarly covered at a later date with sandy, warm-colored stucco, now crumbling away in patches. On chill April and May mornings, thin blue smoke from the chimney of the far house would seem to answer the smoke from the chimney of ours and to translate into another dimension the hissing blaze of cherry logs I had watched my father build in our fireplace. The neighboring farm was owned and run by a mother, Carrie, and a son, Harvey. Even in her unimaginable prime, Carrie could not have been much over 5 feet tall. Now she was so bent by 60 years of stooping labor that in conversation her face was roguishly uptwisted. She wore tight, high-top shoes that put a kind of hop into all her motions, and an old-fashioned bonnet, so that in profile she frightened me with her resemblance to the first bogey of my childhood, the faceless woman on the Dutch cleanser can, chasing herself around and around with a stick. Harvey, called in the country way Harv, was fat but silent-footed. His rap would rattle our door before we knew he was on the porch. There he would stand, surrounded by beagles, an uncocked shotgun drooping from his arm, while my parents vainly tried to invite him in. He preferred to talk outdoors, and his voice was faint and far, like wind caught in a bottle. When at night he hunted coons in our woods, which merged with his, the yapping of his beagles seemed to be escorting a silent spirit that traveled through the trees as resistlessly as the moon overhead traveled through the clouds. In the spring, Harv hitched up their mule and horizontally plowed the gradual rise of land, that mirrored the one where I stood. The linked silhouettes of the man and the mule moved together, back and forth, like a slow brush repainting the parched pallor of the winter-faded land with the wet, dark color of loam. It seemed to be happening in me. And as I age with this century, I hold within myself this memory, this image unearthed from a pastoral epic predating my birth, this deposit lower than which there is only the mineral void. The English excavators of Ur, as they deepened their trench through the strata of rubbish deposited by successive epochs of the Sumerian civilization, suddenly encountered a bed of perfectly clean clay, which they at first took to be the primordial silt of the delta. But measurements were taken, and the clay proved too high to be the original riverbed. Digging deeper, they found that after 8 feet, the clay stopped, yielding to soil again pregnant with flints and potsherds. But whereas Sumerian pottery had been turned on a wheel and not painted, these fragments bore traces of color and had been entirely hand-formed. In fact, the remnants were of an entirely different civilization called Alubaid, and the 8 feet of clay were the physical record of the legendary flood survived by Noah. My existence seems similarly stratified. At the top there is a skin of rubbish, of minutes, hours, and days, and the events and objects that occupy these days. At the bottom, there is the hidden space where Harv, who since his mother died has sold the farm and married and moved to Florida, eternally plows. Between them, as thick as the distance from the grass to the clouds, and no more like clay than fire is like air, interposes the dense vacancy where, like an inundation, the woman came and went. Let us be quite clear. She is not there, but she was there. Proof of this may be discerned in the curious hollowness of virtually every piece of debris examined in the course of scavenging the days. While, of course, great caution should attend assertions about evidence so tenuous, so disjointed, and so befouled with the mud of phlegm and fatigue, each fragment seems hollow in the same way, and a kind of shape, or at least a tendency of motion which, if we could imagine it continuing uninterrupted, would produce a shape, might be hypothesized. But we will be on firmer ground, simply describing the surface layer of days. Abundantly present are small items of wearing apparel, particularly belts and shoelaces, china plates, patterned and plain, stainless steel eating implements, small tables with one loose leg, glasses containing, like irregular jewels hurriedly stashed at the cataclysmic end of an antique queen's reign, ice cubes, children's faces, voices and toys, newspapers, and isolated glimpses of weather, sky, towers, and vegetation. The order of occurrence is not random. Generally, in the probing of each fresh stratum, a toothbrush is the first object encountered, often followed by an automobile gear shift and a ballpoint pen, or a fountain pen which is invariably dry. Contraceptive devices and phials, apparently of medicine, are not uncommon. Sometimes the page of a book is found involved with a bar of soap, and confusing snowstorms of cigarette filters and golf balls must be painstakingly worked through. Care is crucial. Days, though in some their supply of rubbish seems endless, are each an integument of ghostly thinness. At Ur, in the delicate excavations of the tomb of Queen Shubad, a clumsy foot might crush a hidden skull, or a pick driven an inch too deep might prematurely bring to light a bit of gold ribbon, or a diadem, or a golden beech leaf more fragile than a wafer. So too the days of my life threaten, even where the crust appears to be most solid, to crumble and plunge my vision into a dreadful forsaken gold. At the touch of an old hope, the wallpaper parts and reveals the lack of a wall. A lilac bush and the woman's hair engulfs me. Guitar music drifts from a window, and I turn to see if she notices and newly discover that she is not there. Grief fills the cavern of my mouth with a taste like ancient metal, and loss like some sweeping hypothesis of ethereal physics, floods the transparent volume between the grass and the clouds. Vast streets open up, stream outward under the revelation, and the entire world, cities and trees, seems a negative imprint of her absence, a kind of tinted hollowness from which her presence might be rebuilt as wooden artifacts, long rotted to nothing, can be recreated from the impress they have left in clay, a shadow of paint and grain, more easily erased by a finger than the dusty pattern on a butterfly's wing. Imagine a beach at night, the usual immutable web of stars overhead, boats anchored, lightly swapping slaps with the water off the sand, many people, a picnic. There is a large bonfire lighting up faces. She is there. She herself is there, here. Cold with fear, under the mantle of darkness, I go up to her. Restored beside my shoulder, her human smallness amazes and delights me. How are you? Fine, just fine. No, really. Don't ask me. I'm all right. You're looking very well. Thank you. The nervous glitter of her eyes, looking past my shoulder into the fire, translates into yet another dimension the fire my father had set to burning aeons ago. She looks at last at me. The fire goes out in her eyes. She asks, "Would you like some coffee?" I don't have a cup. I have a cup. Thank you. You're very kind, I add, touching the cup that she is touching. Our fingertips don't touch. Don't hate me. I don't hate you. I don't think I do. The taste of metal follows the taste of coffee in my mouth. I'm glad, I say. For me, it's still bad. You like to think that. You enjoy suffering because you don't know what suffering is. And from the trapped quickness with which she moves her head from one side to the other, toward the fire and away, I realize that she is struggling not to cry. A towering exultation seizes me, and for a moment I am again her master, riding the flood. Riding the flood. I protest, I do know. No. I'm sorry you hate me, I say, to wrench a contradiction from her. The contradiction does not come. I don't think that's what it is, she says thoughtfully, and takes our cup from my hand and sips as if to give her words precision. I think it's just that I'm dead. I'm dead to you. And with sweet firmness, she pronounces my name. Please try to understand. I expect nothing from you. It's a great relief. I'm very tired. All I want from you is to be left alone. And I find myself saying yes as she walks away, her long hair bouncing on her back, with the quick, light step she has preserved. Yes, as if I'm giving assent, aloof and scholarly, to the invincible facts around me. The rigid spatter of stars above, the sand that in passing accepts the print of my feet, the sea absent-mindedly tipping pale surf over the edge of darkness, ribbons of phosphorescent white that unravel again and again, always in the same direction, like a typewriter carriage. Where am I? It has ceased to matter. I am infinitesimal, lost, invisible, nothing. I leave the fire, the company of the others, and wander beyond the farthest ring, the circumference where guitar music can still be heard. Something distant is attracting me. I look up, and the stars in their near clarity press upon my face, bear in upon my guilt and shame, with the strange, liquidly strong certainty that, humanly considered, the universe is perfectly transparent. We exist as flaws in ancient glass. And in apprehending this transparence, my mind enters a sudden freedom like insanity. The stars seem to me a roof, the roof of days from which we fall each night and survive, a miracle. I await resurrection. Archaeology is the science of the incredible. Troy and Harappa were fables until the shovel struck home. On the beach at night, it is never totally dark or totally silent. The sea soliloquizes, the moon broods, its glitter pattering in hyphens on the water. And something else is happening, something like the aftermath of a plucked string. What? Having fallen through the void where the woman was, I still live. I move and pause and listen and know. Standing on the slope of sand, I know what is happening across the meadow on the far side of the line where water and air maintain their elemental truth. Harv is plowing now. Thank you. I'm sorry about that. You can read another.
Just so happy. Peter, you want to do?
Well, that's a very complex story and a very beautiful one. And what I'm impressed by is if they allow this to be a love fest. As I've mentioned earlier to Mr. Updike, that his wonderful control of language and the language that controls the story allows him to do the impossible in this story, really, to make it a story, to push the story to where it is a poem, really, and to be so sure of the language and of his images that he can bring it just where he wants it. And I think that's very rare. Everyone who writes is trying to find a way of writing, what his language is to be and what sort of form he is to find, but everybody aspires to write the story that has the complete control, that can make it an essay and it still be a story. I think it's very beautiful.
Yeah, or a poem. And still
or a poem. It's a poem.
This is a kind of attack that surely interests me very much, because it seems to me that some of the methods of modern poetry are among the foremost kinds of thing that modern fiction is doing. The kind of juxtaposition of a love story and archaeology of this sort would again, forgive me, John, if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that that's kind of the method of poetry. This kind of abrupt transition of this sort is something that we expect more of poetry than we do of prose fiction, or did until the last few years.
Well, not many prose fiction writers can do it either, I think, because in reading prose, people are absolutely going to say, well, this is prose, we mustn't do it, and you have to be able to make the language carry it that way, otherwise it just wouldn't work, I think.
Uh-huh.
It certainly is is something you've done in your poetry very beautifully, is the sense of violent edges, sharp edges, breaks, so that there is something of the story is not only what it is, but it's also what it is not, and somehow the space between the things said, the hope generates a certain energy.
Well, I don't know, John. Maybe it's kind of too pat a kind of a juxtaposition here, but I would say that you're coming closer to poetry, and I'm going toward prose.
No, anybody who tries to write like you do realizes it's miles away. It's fire.
But what about the general kind of sensibility that there is in the novel now? I remember in the 30s, for example, that the kind of thing that James T. Farrell did that before him that Dreiser did was considered sort of the sine qua non of prose writing. What do the hippies say? Tell it like it is, or tell it like it was. Mm-hmm. But again, does James T. Farrell tell it like it was? I mean, when he says, again, maybe this is unjust to Farrell. I don't want to make him the whipping boy, but when he says he saw Lucy Scanlon climb into the tree, he wished to be with her very much. He walked down the street with his hands in his pockets, and so on. It's extremely flat kind of, what would you say, reportage. No one could deny that this was true. No one could deny that the boy would feel this way under these particular circumstances. And yet that particular kind of flatness and direct statement has really not served fiction well. If it had, other people would be doing it.
There are many people still writing that way, and I think a certain amount of flatness is just you cannot avoid it. That is my own story. All that, as I was going through all those archaeological things, I was thirsting to get to the dialogue, which is very simple and flat. And but there is certainly always somehow a need to capture what's in the corners of your vision as well as in the front of it, and there are a lot of ways to skin this cat, I think. I don't think we need to be too hypnotized by people who leave out periods and drop the capital letters. I think there's a lot more. I find Mr. Taylor's work full of just the kind of resonance of things implied, things, a truth caught in the fullness of its ambiguity, or it's either or-ness. It's, I don't express it well, but you know when you have a live cat on the bag.
Peter?
Well, the flatness of the dialogue seems to be, we were talking about, is often a real flatness of sight. I really think that it doesn't have the depth, that the dialogue must really be as rich as the other two, and that yours is in there. The dialogue is not, you wouldn't put it next to Farrell's dialogue or something like that. It's not the same sort of thing. It's not giving us the facts in the case. It comes as sort of a refrain. After the rest of the narrative, it comes as almost lyrical. When people, it's magic when people speak suddenly in the story. That's my impression of it.
I think
so that you're doing more than just, it's not just dialogue, really, in there.
The whole question of how people do speak now, it's a question of ear, and there's a stage in your life when you almost stop listening. I hope I haven't reached it yet, but Southern writers do seem to be surrounded by people more verbal in a more interesting way. That is, the things that governor's wife said, or somehow I can't picture the governor of newly elected Vermont quite coming out with the, not that she's a stupider woman, but somehow there's not the verbal resource, both in terms of illusion and in grace of expression, in rotundity of expression somehow.
Well, of course, that's what interests me, is that you resort, though, to finding language of some sort. If you don't have the gifts really for narrative that you have, the real control of the whole range of the English language. Everyone has his experience with language, and you reach out to find the parts that are most alive for you. And perhaps because Southerners are garrulous and tale-telling and so on, that language is very important to us, and we have to do something with it. And then too, it's often your limitations. If you don't have the great style, you find you can work with Flannery O'Connor, someone that if you ever saw first drafts of her stories would not, you just couldn't believe that they would become what they were, because she worked so hard at finding the right language for them.
Yeah, it seems to me that there are really two kinds of approaches to fiction. Maybe there are lots of different sub-varieties of these. But they both have something to do with what the writers are pleased to call truth. The Farrell and Dreiser type of writer is going to look askance at what Philip Roth called the pale face type of Mandarin prose, and they're going to go for what they think of as the raw stuff of life. And if you write an extremely reportorial kind of prose that simply tells events and people speaking of them in sort of monosyllabic and extremely understated ways, this is going to be their version of truth. And yet there's kind of a literal truth and an emotional truth or imaginative truth, which is quite different from the literal. And it seems to me that from what I've read, that the most paid attention to of the contemporary writers are going for the more difficult kind of truth, which has affinities with poetry, rather than affinities with the newspaper.
I don't. I was just going to say, to defend Dreiser, I'm not a great Dreiserian, but I do think that he was, in a way, a great man of American letters that authentic talent will try to go for that aspect of reality which seems to him to be eclipsed by the present literary conventions. And I think that in a genteel era, in an era of Dreiser's, the kinds of things he was saying were well worth saying, and it's true now he seems a little coarse, and Garrel not too much. Nevertheless, there is life there, and there was the... I wish I could feel that my contemporaries or I myself knew certainly what they wanted to do as Dreiser knew what he wanted to do. I feel in my, a kind of confusion, a kind of knocking around, a lack of the kind of program that Dreiser had and that Virginia Woolf in her way had, a really definite sense of what was the matter with past fiction, what needed to be done now. We live at a kind of an age when one fears that it's all been done or all been attempted. This is only half true. In one's own life, one is still excited and feels one has more to say.
Well, don't you feel, though, that Dreiser is more important to us sort of historically than in any other way, that what he felt should be done at that time, and he did make a breakthrough in his sort, but that Hemingway really has put an end to seems to me, to simple reporting in fiction. That is, you can only do it if you seem to be if you're simply reporting. You've got to be doing, and Hemingway does much more than that. When he seems to be telling a simple story and to be just reporting, it's really very poetic.
Yes, this is exactly my feeling. There's a very great deal of difference between the kind of extremely evocative understatement that Hemingway does and Dreiser at the end of an awful book of his called The Genius, in which he attempts to portray an artist when he ends by having his artist, Eugene Whitler, dreaming great art dreams in the firelight.
Really? These are the words?
If you go to the book, the last page of the book, that's what you find. He's dreaming those great art dreams.
Well, another thing I was interested in you're saying, I'm glad you said before, how you really first conceived of that story, for instance. That's always fascinating me, that to think that you conceived of it first in the three images. This just come to you? I mean, you just had these...
No, I was thinking as I was reading it, I was wondering why on earth I'd put these things in. I was trying to reconstruct that moment in my life at which somehow one thing about people, critics and so on, imagine that a writer has the world to choose from, and actually he's really he's struck with only the little bit he knows, and he uses it all at least twice. And there was a moment in my life when the only things that seemed to interest me were this memory of having lived, without much being aware of it, but having lived across the valley from a farm where a mule was still used. Now, this in Pennsylvania was pretty, really, a remnant of a much earlier era. And in a way, it was a curious thing to happen to a young adolescent, who was very urban-oriented, to be plucked down into a piece of 1880. And then the quite, to me at least, interesting details of the excavation at Ur, and then something human that must have struck me at the time. Anyway, these three things, it may have been an illusion, but in some way they did fuse, yes, and I did not begin the story but with all three in mind, and how they have to get into my mind at the same time, I don't know.
Listen, John, I wouldn't want to insist on a point here, but that's frighteningly like what I have always conceived, the method of the poet, to start with the three maybe unrelated things of this sort. I don't know enough about prose fiction and to say that this is more true of poetry than it is of prose. Nevertheless, it seems to me more true of the practice of poets that I know and have read about than it is a... This seems to me that particular kind of an approach, say their approach to a story through images, is much more traditionally poetic than it is prose. Prose,
well, and it's usually, again, I'm saying it's just deadly to so many writers to try. It is to me when I've tried taken a certain kind of experience, an area experience, and wanted to write a story from it, and then tried to force it into that would have been a great mistake in it, to force it too much into some conventional plot. That would have it just killed it. And you had to do it just that way. That's what seems miraculous to me.
Well, it seems to me that what I know of prose fiction has indicated that there has been, say, in the last 20 years, a new opening up of fiction to this kind of approach and many other kinds of approaches that have never been available to fiction before. To take our old bête noire, Dreiser, which I don't intend him as that at all. I admire him very much. Mostly.
You're not very convinced.
You haven't given us that.
But he would have thought of the story simply as the chronicle of the rise and fall of Frank Cowperwood, the financial genius. He wouldn't have thought of it as in terms of images and in terms of juxtapositions in the mind of the creator, which would then have to be dealt with on their own terms, maybe calling for a new form. That would have been incomprehensible to him, but it isn't to us.
I think there's a size limit, just as the way insects are built limits how big they can get. A story of this nature can't be too long because you pretty rapidly need suspense, and I'm not sure there was too much in this except what outrageous.
I think it was the shifting of tones and the shift.
But hopefully,
you know, another thing is that other people have said this too. I'm sure that the short story has really replaced the personal essay and essays in our literature in the last 100 years or so, and that this is a way. Now and then you'll find a writer, a fiction writer, who does bring it back and can really give the whole. Because you lose something, you gain a great deal when you begin to put a character in an essay and to build it around a person. You gain a great deal. Just as painting, when you begin to put a figure in it, it gets a new interest. Well, around a character. If you build it around a character, you add it, but then you lose something of the essay. Then you lose the ability to be explicit and to really to speak at length on some kind of experience.
Yeah, well, again, talking about the availability of an enormous body of approach and an enormous body of kinds of writing to prose fiction now. I think the essay has been much underrated since Proust. Think of the number of essays that he wrote in his fiction. My boy Chris and I were just reading one of the essays of Hazlitt today, and it seemed to me a marvelous thing when he was talking about why human beings like to look off into distances and at mountains. Because he says that one can people best that part of the landscape which is most near invisibility, or nearest to nothing, something like that, a distant mountain or something of that sort. Well, I guess we'll have to wind up this evening's entertainment or soiree or whatever it is. But I do want to whatever has been solved or unsolved, we would like to think very much that we've left something in your mind to think about from the particular conjunction in time at this particular evening of yourself and Mr. Peter Taylor and John Updike, with my own modest participation, hardly more than a ghost. Here at this time, at this place. So.
Don't forget your wire.
Fiction, a conversation with John Updike and Peter Taylor, has been presented by WETA in cooperation with the Library of Congress. The library's literary programs are made possible by the Gertrude Clark Whitall Poetry and Literature Fund.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.